At dawn on March 23, 1943, a thin light slid down the ridges west of a valley the Americans called El Ghoutar. In a forward command post a few hundred yards from the front, Major General Terry Allen raised his binoculars. The silhouettes that filled the narrow gap below were unmistakable. A river of steel and rubber, the distinctive motor rhythm of tracked vehicles, 50 armored shapes pouring out of a mountain pass and into the open. Engines hummed. The air tasted of dust and diesel. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sweep of metal and the small cluster of men around Allen who were waiting for orders they had only recently been taught to give and receive a different way. Less than 4 weeks earlier, the American Army in North Africa had been humiliated at Kasserine Pass. The same inexperienced troops, the same young units, had been beaten in the open by seasoned German formations. 6,500 casualties, heavy losses in tanks and equipment, and a politics of blame that reached to London and Washington. Public confidence sagged. Allied commanders exchanged worried telegrams. In the span between those two images, the routed Kasserine and the line of German panzers now moving into that valley, the American force in Tunisia underwent a radical, concentrated transformation. The question that sits at the heart of this episode is not just tactical. How, in 27 days, could an army convert humiliation into the capacity to stop and destroy an elite armored thrust? The more consequential question is institutional. What allowed the American Army, in that crucible, to learn and act so quickly? If the scene at El Ghoutar is cinematic, dawn light, steel glinting, a general with binoculars, the explanation begins in a courtroom of command and a seminar of logistic possibility. The raw facts are stark. The defeated Kasserine had exposed problems at many levels: leadership, doctrine, communications, training, and it prompted a rapid, unflinching response from Allied leadership in theater. Dwight Eisenhower ordered an immediate, candid after-action review that did not seek to paper over failure. With authority concentrated in theater command, changes that otherwise might have taken months were authorized and pushed through in a matter of weeks. In parallel, a charismatic and uncompromising leader arrived to restore standards and morale. George S. Patton did what Patton always did. He took discipline personally and made it visible. But Patton's 17-day crusade of inspections and insistence on basic soldiering, foxholes filled, uniforms correct, weapons clean, small unit drills rehearsed, was only half the story. The other half was technical and procedural. Staff officers rewired the way artillery fires were controlled. Radio nets and fire direction procedures were standardized. Tank and tank destroyer employment were rethought. Air-ground liaison was reorganized. Those changes, backed by an industrial supply line that could deliver guns, tanks, radios, and men, were drilled until they became reflex. When the German armor came down the valley on March 23rd, the reforms arrived with them. To follow that transformation, we have to start, unavoidably, with failure. Kasserine Pass in February 1943 was a lesson in what happens when units lack cohesion, when commanders are separated from the fight by distance or ambiguity, and when doctrine meets an enemy who has honed a different set of habits in battle. American formations in Tunisia had been composed of a mix of raw divisions and units still learning the basics of combined arms. Officers at division and corps level were often inexperienced in managing mass fires. The British, hardened by campaigns in the desert, and the Germans, seasoned by campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, watched with concern as American columns were sliced, as flanks collapsed, as supply dumps were lost. Newspapers and commanders in London asked how an army that had grown so quickly could be so brittle. Kasserine produced a political and military jolt. Casualty lists, captured documents, and the vivid accounts of soldiers trickled back to the American public. In theater, General Eisenhower insisted that the truth be named. He demanded that failures be cataloged and understood, not to punish with spectacle, but to create a foundation for rapid correction. That decision to insist on candor, to make an honest inventory of errors, is the first of the institutional themes that explain speed. Had the theater command chosen defensiveness, whitewash, and bureaucratic hedging, the learning curve would have been slow. Instead, the after-action review in late February was thorough and public within the theater staff. Mistakes of command placement, of piecemeal employment of armor and artillery, of inadequate coordination between air, artillery, and ground units, and critical failures of communication were all placed on a table and discussed with an urgency that matched the tactical situation. A second, parallel change was the reallocation of authority. Eisenhower's position in Tunisia was not to micromanage individual battalions, but to clear obstacles and set priorities. When he relieved Major General Lloyd Fredendall, a decision that focused on Fredendall's tendency to position his headquarters too far from the fighting and to dilute command authority, it signaled that theater command would not tolerate command arrangements that inhibited mutual support and rapid decision. Fredendall's relief was dramatic in effect, if not theatrical in execution. History remembers it for what it represented more than the particulars. Commanders closer to the fight and those willing to accept responsibility at division and corps level were empowered to organize their forces so they could mass fires and avoid penny packets of isolated units that the Germans could pick off. Into that space, Patton arrived. His entry into the theater was not merely ceremonial. It was a practical demonstration that leadership could compress time. Patton's approach was surgical in its simplicity. Fix the basics, insist on standards, and rehearse the routines that make complex actions reliable. He did not invent doctrine, he enforced its implementation. Over 17 days, he walked through bivouacs and command posts. He inspected foxholes for proper camouflage and depth. He ordered that officers be visible and accountable. He demanded training repetitions for platoons and companies until reaction to enemy action had become reflexive. For every careless exposure of a unit, there was a punitive correction or an immediate rehearsal to address it. The psychological effect of Patton's campaign was as important as its practical outcomes. Troops who had felt demoralized by Kasserine began to take pride in small things again. The depth of a foxhole, the reliability of a radio, the clarity of a command link to neighboring units. Discipline restored the conditions under which doctrine could function. Yet discipline and morale were only part of the equation. On the doctrinal and technical side, Eisenhower's staff in Tunisia undertook a concentrated campaign of reform. Artillery, long the decisive arm on the North African open battlefield, had been used in a way that dispersed rather than concentrated effect. Officers reworked procedures for centralized fire direction so that divisional and corps artillery could deliver massed fire for effect rather than small scattered salvos. The change required clear chains of command for fire control, more disciplined use of radio nets, and a culture in which forward observers, the men who went forward with map, pencil, and radio to find the target and call in the coordinates, were trusted and protected. A forward observer, simply put, is the human link between the eye on the battlefield and the big guns behind the line. When the observer and the fire director operate on the same procedures and frequencies, artillery becomes a decisive, contiguous presence rather than an episodic one. Armor doctrine was rewritten in tandem. Earlier in the campaign, American tanks had been used in ways that invited close engagement with German panzers on the latter's terms. Now tanks were reimagined as mobile fire support for infantry. Tank destroyers, specialized vehicles designed to hunt and engage enemy armor, were to be concentrated rather than parceled out in small detachments. A tank destroyer battalion, to define it in simple terms, was a unit organized not as a replacement for tanks, but as a complementary force. Lightly armored, fast, and designed to engage enemy tanks with powerful guns and mobility. The theater staff insisted these battalions be massed at decisive points where their firepower could be brought to bear en masse against attacking armored formations. That procedural change meant both doctrine and deployment had to shift. Radios had to be standardized. Battalion and battery commanders had to be trained to seek decisive engagement rather than chasing shadows. And infantry positions had to be prepared to funnel attacking armor into zones where mines, massed artillery, and anti-armor fire could be synchronized. Air-ground liaison received similar attention. Previously, air support had often been improvised or delayed by unclear routing and competing priorities. Staff officers created procedures for assigning air liaison officers to corps and division headquarters, establishing dedicated radio nets and pre-planned strike packages. The principle was simple and modern. Integrate air as a component of combined arms, not as an unpredictable appendage. When a forward observer or battalion commander needed immediate air suppression of a target, the channels to secure that support had to be known, rehearsed, and rapid. The final technical piece was communications. Radios, frequency discipline, call sign standardization. These bureaucratic details are the muscle memory of modern warfare. In Tunisia, the staff tightened radio procedures, enforced net discipline, and prioritized the distribution of more reliable radio sets. That required logistics. Shipments of sets from North Africa's supply points and the factory belt back in the United States had to be speeded and managed. This is where American industrial weight became an operational factor rather than a general strategic advantage. A doctrine can be written on the back of a table. It becomes reality only when radios, guns, and vehicles arrive and are driven into position. All of these reforms, discipline imposed by Patton, procedural rewiring by Eisenhower's staff, the arrival of radios and tank destroyers, the recalibration of how artillery would be used, were helpless without deliberate rehearsal. The armies in Tunisia turned themselves into practice fields for the new doctrine. Units practiced combined arms barrages. Forward observers rehearsed the process of finding and adjusting fire. Tank destroyer units practiced concentrated engagement. The aim was not to create flawless plans, but to create predictable human patterns. Under stress, humans do what they have practiced. If forward observers had called in massed fires a dozen times in the weeks after Kasserine, they would be more likely to do it correctly when the first German hull appeared through the cut in the ridge. Patton's discipline campaign and the staff's doctrinal reforms happened on slightly different timescales and addressed different levels of the problem. One rebuilt the human framework of order and morale. The other rewired the machine of war. The combination, cultural discipline plus procedural certainty, is what allowed the Americans to compress what might have been a 6-month institutional learning curve into 27 hard, focused days. It helps to look at one detail to see why these changes mattered. Before the reforms, artillery fire was often allocated piecemeal, a few rounds at dispersed targets, leaving the enemy with a chance to press through seams. After the rewiring, divisional artillery could shift into coordinated fire, laying down prolonged barrages on likely enemy approach corridors. Imagine a stream of shells that does not stop because of fear of wasting ammo or the difficulty of finding the target, but one that is allowed to run until the enemy's movement is physically checked. That is a small doctrinal shift with large tactical implications. It turns artillery from a supporting actor into a theater-controlling force. Similarly, the idea of concentrating tank destroyers at battalion level rather than scattering them prevents an attacker from dialectically defeating a dispersed defense. A single tank destroyer battery might be bypassed and rendered irrelevant. A massed battalion can lay in wait and unleash a withering volume of fire when the enemy compresses into a killing zone. These are the sorts of adjustments that look technical, but have strategic consequences when combined with improved communications and the psychological effect of renewed discipline. By mid-March, the theater was different. New radios had arrived at key battalions. Artillery brigades practiced coordinated fire-for-effect missions. Tank destroyer battalions reorganized their holdings, creating reserve concentrations that could be rushed to threatened sectors. Patton's inspections had inspired, and at times intimidated, officers into paying attention to the small things that matter: camouflaged positions, rehearsed withdrawal routes, and deliberate mutual support between adjacent units. Not every change was perfect or universally loved. There were British eyebrows raised at some of the more direct American fixes, and German intelligence was careful not to overstate the significance of isolated improvements. In the short term, such criticisms mattered little. In practice, the American units in Tunisia were moving from improvisation to procedure, and procedure beats improvisation when a disciplined enemy is on the march. The days immediately prior to March 23 were a tension of drills and silence. Mines were emplaced in the likely avenues of approach. Engineers and sappers recorded the patterns so the gunners could identify choke points. Artillery units emplaced in depth calibrated their guns to overlapping arcs, and forward observers took up observation posts with direct lines of sight to the passes. Tank destroyer battalions were told the names of reserve positions and rehearsal schedules for rapid movement into the valley. At the company and platoon level, soldiers were told not just what to do, but when and why. The small teaching moments that convert compliance into initiative. A platoon leader who understood the plan could make a split-second decision that aligned with the overall scheme, rather than acting independently and creating gaps. On the night before the attack, those arrangements became almost ritual. Officers checked maps and message procedures. Radio operators tested frequencies and logged call signs. Messengers walked the lines to confirm the location of listening posts. The overall effect was a reduction of friction, the term Clausewitz used for the inevitable errors and delays of war, achieved by exhaustive, even mundane preparation. When the first silhouettes of steel appeared the following morning, commanders did not need to invent a response. The procedures and rehearsals carried the weight of decision. Forward observers called in registered targets with coordinates known to the fire direction centers. Artillery batteries shifted into sustained fire, not the cautious, measured salvos of months earlier, but fire that continued until countering the momentum of the attack was assured. Mines did their job, scattering and slowing the mechanized columns and turning the enemy's advantage in speed into a liability as vehicles bunched and became targetable. Tank destroyers, sighted and waiting, engaged with concentrated volleys. Infantry positions, dug and camouflaged, used pre-planned fields of fire to funnel attackers toward kill zones. That sequence, mines first, then continuous artillery, then concentrated anti-armor fire, was not an accident. It was the materialization of decisions made in staff rooms and on bivouac squares since Kasserine. It was also the product of a theater that had allowed candid assessment to become rapid reform, where authority was arranged to permit local commanders to act with clarity, and where logistics and industry supplied the necessary tools. When the 10th Panzer Division, the German armored force identified in the records of the engagement, found itself being ground down by a synchronized American defense, the war in that valley ceased to be an arena in which German initiative could create a breakthrough. It is tempting to attribute that result to a single factor: superior American numbers, or Patton's charisma, or the luck of bad weather for the attackers. That would be a mistake. The narrative that holds together is cumulative. Discipline, doctrine, communications, logistics, and repeated rehearsal combined into a defensive system whose elements amplified one another. In the quiet after the shooting that afternoon, when the German units began to withdraw and American units counted the wreckage, commanders on both sides adjusted their mental models about what the American army could do when it applied itself decisively. There are human stories inside those broad shifts. A captain in a field artillery battery who had seen his rounds scattered uselessly at Kasserine now sat at a radio, his finger finding the right net and his voice steady as he requested and then received correction from a forward observer. An NCO who had been corrected severely by Patton for sloppy camouflage weeks earlier now led his squad to an observation post and watched the enemy tanks stumble into a minefield that was quiet and bright in the morning light until the explosions turned the air opaque. These are the small moments that, stitched together, become operational outcomes. We pause here at the edge of the valley and the immediate anticipation of engagement, because that pause is where the story becomes tactical and urgent. The Americans had remade how they fought in a matter of weeks, not by miracle, but by a combination of institutional candor, delegated authority, disciplined leadership, procedural overhaul, and the raw capacity to supply and rehearse new configurations. Whether that would be enough in practice would be answered by the next hours in the valley. Whether it would have longer consequences for the Allied effort in North Africa and beyond would be decided in the campaigns that followed. For now, the men in the forward post watched the black shapes move. The guns were laid, the forward observers breathed, and a system the American Army had built in less than a month waited to be tested. They had built it. Now the test arrived. The first shells fell like punctuation marks into the pale morning. From his forward post, Major General Terry Allen watched the valley tighten into a corridor of smoke and shrapnel. A forward observer's voice crackled over a disciplined net. Grid reference, range, fire for effect. The guns replied. At a battery some miles behind the ridge, a captain read the correction back and his crews laid their tubes. The initial rounds were registration, precise, deliberate, and then the batteries opened into sustained fire that did not ebb. Where artillery had once offered occasional interruption, it now poured a continuous corrective pressure across the axis of advance. The German column, identified by American spotters as elements of the 10th Panzer Division, had expected a series of local skirmishes. It found instead a landscape prepared to turn its speed into trap. Mines, laid in depths and patterns rehearsed by engineers, started the process. Tanks that crossed into those prepared passages stalled or lost tracks. Others slowed to clear fields of fire, compressing the formation. Bunched vehicles are easier to see through binoculars. They are also, as the Americans had calculated, easier to kill. Artillery again did the work of shaping the battlefield. The forward observer adjusted, calling in shifts as the enemy tried to redeploy. Batteries shifted fire on prearranged target numbers without waiting for permissive signals. The chain of command for fires had been simplified so that a single call could unleash the mass of divisional and corps artillery. Shells fell in patterns designed to channel movement rather than just to punish it, thudding into defilades and turning possible maneuver lanes into lethal gutters of smoke and torn metal. Tank destroyers, which had been staged in depth and held as a mobile reserve, now pushed forward into sectors where the enemy's armor had been slowed. These were not piecemeal interventions, but deliberate, concentrated volleys. Multiple guns firing in overlapping arcs to saturate the likely path of a German breakthrough. The doctrine was simple and stark. Let the enemy accumulate where you can see him, and then let every available anti-armor weapon pour into that accumulation. Where once American doctrine had permitted dispersed, reactive employment of these assets, the new rules required concentration at decisive points. The result was visible within minutes as German tanks that had expected to overrun a gullied line instead found themselves the focus of converging kill zones. Infantry, too, played its part. Foxholes were deeper, fields of fire more carefully prepared. Platoon and company leaders, recently drilled until the coordinates and contingencies were reflex, ordered fire and maneuver with a speed born of rehearsal. Machine guns and anti-tank guns caught the flanks of armored vehicles as they tried to wheel away. The combined arms picture, the art of bringing infantry, armor, anti-armor, artillery, and air into a single, coherent response, was not merely an abstract slogan but a practiced choreography. Each element moved at the times and to the places that the rehearsals had taught them. Air support, where available, struck pre-planned targets with surprising rapidity. Liaison officers at Corps and Division headquarters, who had been newly empowered and equipped with standard procedures, coordinated strikes that suppressed German mobile artillery and strafed exposed crews. The difference from earlier months was this: Aircraft were no longer capricious desks, but anticipated components of the defense. Their sorties called for in advance and integrated into the tempo of the ground fight. From the German perspective, the picture blurred into chaos. Drivers and crews who had trained for rapid exploitation now found themselves picked off in obvious kill zones. Commanders on the other side of the assault reported radio clutter and the disruptive effect of mines that had slowed formations into prearranged artillery envelopes. Where speed had promised to carry the day, it exposed them to cumulative attrition. By mid-morning, the action had crystallized into a set of clear outcomes. Several mechanized companies of the German force were immobilized by mines. Others suffered direct hits from concentrated artillery. Tank destroyer volleys punctured hulls and disabled turrets. The attackers' initiative, which had been their strongest asset at Kasserine, was neutralized by a procedure-driven defense that turned motion into vulnerability. Yet the battle was not a single clean stroke. It was messy in all the human ways that war is. Smoke drifted into observation points. Radios garbled messages. Men shouted over engine whine. Leaders had to adapt on the fly, and not all adaptations were perfect. A reserve that moved too slowly found itself, instead of being a decisive counterattack, merely a late reinforcement. A battery misread a coordinate and sent rounds onto a friendly position for an anxious hour before correction could be made. These frictions did not erase the broader triumph. They simply reminded everyone that the system was not automatic. It required human competence and a willingness to shoulder responsibility in moments of confusion, the very qualities the reforms had tried to produce. As the afternoon wore on, the Germans began to withdraw, not in orderly fallback, but in a gradual collapse of momentum. The 10th Panzer Division had been checked and damaged. Its ability to resume a coordinated offensive that day was over. American units, for their part, counted wrecked vehicles and gathered prisoners. Casualty figures flowed into headquarters, losses, shock, and the tallying of what the defenders had achieved. The spectacle of twisted steel and burned rubber in the valley was a blunt arithmetic of combat, but it was also evidence that the theater's compressed reforms could survive the chaos of real battle. Beyond the immediate tactical victory, commanders and Allied headquarters noticed something subtler. British staff watching the maps and German reports began to revise judgments expressed only weeks earlier. Where British commentators had once viewed American units as unreliable improvisers who might crumble under pressure, after Elgatar, the language shifted toward grudging respect. German analysts, too, acknowledged in intelligence summaries that the Americans had adopted procedures that made them less susceptible to the kind of local infiltration and dislocation that had been successful months earlier. Neither side, however, announced wholesale conclusions in public. Professional militaries are cautious to avoid overreaching interpretation from a single engagement. Still, the reassessments were real and they mattered. The days after March 23 were consumed with exploitation and consolidation. American command posts adjusted to the new reality. Where units could, they advanced on prepared grounds. Where British advances created opportunities, linkages were made. The Axis position in Tunisia was brittle in several sectors, and the pressure from reformed American formations combined with British offensives pushed gaps to the breaking point. Within weeks, the theater swung in favor of the Allies. Isolated German and Italian units were encircled and forced to surrender. Elgatar did not single-handedly end the campaign. Far larger strategic currents were at play, but it was a catalytic moment. It proved that the reforms would function in combat, that a concentrated application of combined arms could blunt and then reverse German operational advantages. That operational result invites a sober accounting. What had enabled so rapid a conversion from failure to credible combat performance? The answer is not a single heroic anecdote, but 5 systemic features that, combined, explain the American speed of adaptation in Tunisia. Each one deserves attention because together they constituted the mechanism by which weeks rather than months or years produced a new fighting machine. First, candid assessment. The theater's after-action scrutiny refused to conceal mistakes. Eisenhower's insistence on a truthful inventory created an environment in which problems could be diagnosed without the diversion of political obfuscation. In organizational terms, candor shortened the feedback loop between failure and reform. Commanders were required to account, to explain, and then to accept corrective measures. That frankness, painful as it was for individuals, was the necessary precondition for targeted change. Second, decentralized authority calibrated by clear priorities. Eisenhower did not micromanage tactical minutiae. He cleared obstacles and set theater-level priorities. At the same time, he removed command arrangements that inhibited rapid decision-making, most famously the relief of Major General Lloyd Fredendall, whose headquarters placement and command style inhibited mutual support. This reallocation of authority mattered because it allowed those closest to the fight to act within an authorized framework. Theater commands set the ends and cleared the means, local commanders controlled the tactical details. The combination of clear priorities and empowered subordinates is a classic lever of institutional agility. Third, resource abundance as an operational enabler. The United States' industrial capacity meant that when procedures demanded radios, guns, tank destroyers, or ammunition, the logistics system could respond relatively quickly. This is an obvious point, but an often underappreciated one. Doctrine that cannot be resourced remains aspirational. In Tunisia, the availability of material shipped into theater and pushed forward to the units that needed it translated doctrine into practice. Radios arrived at batteries and companies. Tank destroyer units received repair parts. Artillery crews were replenished. Without this logistical throughput, the procedural changes would have stalled in command rooms. Fourth, a willingness to learn from the enemy. The American staff did not treat German success as an unassimilable mystery. Rather, observers and intelligence officers studied German tactics and adapted certain elements, particularly operational art in use of combined arms, while rejecting others that were ill-suited to American organization. This mentality of selective imitation and of learning without hubris accelerated effective change. To be clear, learning from the enemy does not imply copying wholesale. It means identifying the principles behind successful actions and integrating those principles into one's own cultural and doctrinal matrix. Fifth, intensive, focused training and rehearsal. The human brain and body are primed to act according to practiced patterns. The theater's insistence on repeated drills, on radio discipline rehearsals, on forward observer procedures, and on rapid counter-movement practices created muscle memory. When smoke and shock arrived, the units performed, not because they were perfectly trained in theory, but because they had practiced the essential responses until the actions were predictable. Practice reduced the friction of decision-making and increased the likelihood that small unit leaders would take initiative that aligned with the larger scheme. Read together, these 5 elements, candid assessment, delegated authority with clear priorities, logistical sufficiency, an adaptive learning posture, and intensive rehearsal, offer a plausible account for why the American Army in Tunisia compressed a learning cycle that elsewhere might have taken far longer. It is important to stress the qualifiers in that claim. In the transcript's terms, the Americans adapted faster in that theater and time frame than some of their allies and adversaries. But this was a function of specific advantages and dispositions rather than an absolute fact to be generalized without context. Comparative claims deserve nuance. British armies had their own strengths, gathered by long desert campaigns and shaped by different institutional histories. Soviet forces, fighting on a colossal and brutal front, operated under constraints and scales that made direct comparison misleading. German divisions, for all their tactical acumen, could be defeated by the same systemic lessons, procedural integration and resource pressure that worked in Tunisia. What distinguished the American case in that place and time was the confluence of leadership willingness to admit error, the capacity to change at scale, and the material means to make those changes real. Institutionally, the legacy of Tunisia rippled forward. After-action review became less an occasional exercise and more a procedural habit. Training schools incorporated lessons about coordination of fires, air-ground liaison, and anti-armor employment.
Doctrine was not frozen, but updated. Lessons were written into field manuals, commanders were briefed on newly tested procedures, and future theaters benefited from the codification of practices that had proven themselves under fire. By Sicily and Salerno, and later in Normandy, the American Army carried forward an institutional memory that recognized the value of candid feedback loops and of binding doctrine to logistics and training. That said, reform is never absolute. The United States would still face setbacks and learning moments in later campaigns. No organization becomes invulnerable simply by learning once. Yet the Tunisian episode became part of a pattern. An army that could, when pressed, convert operational pain into procedural improvement with surprising speed. This capacity mattered not only for the particular victories it enabled in 1943, but for the institutional culture it seeded, one that accepted critique, rewarded initiative within a clear command framework, and insisted that doctrine be tested and made habitual at the lowest levels. Personal stories keep the strategic account human. A lieutenant who had failed to coordinate with neighboring units at Kasserine found himself months later receiving a terse, private reprimand from a new staff officer, and then placed on a schedule of practical exercises that, frustrating as they were, turned his unit's response into a predictable tool. He would later write that the drills were the difference between panic and purpose. A communications sergeant who had once guarded his set as the only available frequency now worked on a standard net with other units, its discipline enforced by both junior NCOs and senior officers. When battle noise came, he found that everything else on the net already expected his call sign. The friction of establishing contact had been removed. Even small moments of leadership mattered. An old colonel whose hands trembled when he took the field after a long illness, nevertheless kept to a schedule of visits to forward positions, insisting that junior officers be visible and that their maps be simple and realistic. That insistence, patent style in miniature, helped coax a culture in which commanders were expected to know the terrain and the contingencies rather than sit aloof behind lines of staff. Visibility and accountability, when combined with procedural clarity, reduce the possibility of paralysis when the bullets start to fly. There were dissenting voices. Some British officers privately worried about American impatience with coalition politics and with the sometimes abrasive manner in which personalities like Patton expressed urgency. Some German reports later implied that Axis forces had been overextended and that logistical shortfalls on their side explained much of the collapse in Tunisia. Both points have merit. Coalition warfare complicates reform, and enemy errors certainly affect outcomes. But neither point negates the central lesson. The American ability to convert internal failure into a set of tested, practice-driven procedures expedited their restoration of combat effectiveness. Strategically, the Tunisian campaign fed into larger consequences. The collapse of Axis positions in North Africa opened the Mediterranean, eased supply lines, and set conditions for invasion campaigns that followed. American forces, now demonstrably capable of integrating doctrine with logistics and leadership, would play a central role in subsequent operations that required the same kinds of combined arms discipline and rehearsal. The institutional memory from Tunisia, an after-action culture, improved artillery coordination, a doctrine for tank destroyer employment, and standardized air-ground liaison was not ephemeral. It was folded into training regiments and staff procedures that shaped the Army's approach through 1944 and 1945. A measured historiographical caution is still necessary. One should not read Tunisia like a parable that explains every later success. Context matters. Terrain, enemy composition, allied politics, and sheer chance all influence outcomes. But as a case study in rapid organizational learning under pressure, El Ghoutar and the preceding weeks stand as a striking example.
The American Army's speed of adaptation in that theater was not a miracle, but a concatenation of institutional choices and material capacities, choices that others might have been unable or unwilling to make at that particular time. Back in the forward command post, as dusk fell over the valley, Major General Terry Allen watched the remaining German vehicles withdraw like dark punctuation rolling out of the lower gaps. Men in the command group understood the scale of what had been done and the fragility of their achievement. They also understood that habits had been formed, habits of candor, of rehearsal, of an insistence that the machine of war be tuned to reality, and that leaders be accountable for its function. In the days that followed, Eisenhower's staff continued to catalog lessons, and Patton resumed his campaigns of visibility and insistence on standards. Both approaches, the bureaucratic and the personal, had proved complementary. In the end, the valley at El Guitar remained a textbook example of what happens when institutional humility meets decisive action. The line between defeat and recovery was not a single day's heroism, but a sequence of deliberate, rehearsed adjustments that together produced a durable change in combat performance. That sequence offers a lesson beyond military history. Organizations that can identify failure openly, empower those closest to operational problems, resource the solutions, learn from competent adversaries, and practice the new routines will shorten their learning curves under pressure.
If this story is compelling to you, take a moment now, like and subscribe so we can bring more detailed episodes of military adaptation and leadership to this channel. The theater's experience reverberated. In staff colleges and command meetings beyond North Africa, officers debated which elements of the Tunisian reforms would translate to other environments. Some advocated wholesale adoption of the new artillery procedures and concentration of anti-armor units. Others warned that different terrains or enemy behaviors would require different configs. That debate was healthy because it recognized that doctrine must remain adaptive. The real institutional change was not a single doctrinal victory, but the normalization of debate grounded in tested practice. Histories that treat adaptation as a one-off privilege the moment rather than the mechanism. Tunisia, by contrast, reveals how institutional processes changed. Candid after-action assessment became an expected step after major battles. Theater commanders grew more willing to reassign authority when it inhibited mutual support. Supply chains and industrial responsiveness began to be factored directly into operational planning, and training regiments emphasized not only the technical but the procedural, how radios, observers, and guns would interact under compressive stress. Across the Atlantic and the Pacific, armies watched and learned in their own ways. Some allies moved cautiously, hampered by different resource constraints or organizational styles. Some adversaries, notably the German High Command, registered an uncomfortable respect for the Americans' ability to convert deficiencies into practical solutions. The transcript's comparative framing is careful. It does not claim an absolute superiority for the American model in every theater or era, but it does argue convincingly that in the specific context of Tunisian operations in early 1943, the U.S. Army's rate of institutional change outpaced that of other forces operating in comparable conditions. The strategic consequence of that speed was not a solitary victory, but a series of opportunities. Once the theater could generate reliable combined arms responses, Allied operational planners could consider more ambitious maneuvers, confident that American formations would perform against hardened opposition. That had ripple effects on campaign planning and on the allocation of forces in subsequent operations. The moral of the story sits somewhere between humility and confidence. Humility because the reforms began when leaders acknowledged their failures. Confidence because they then acted decisively to remedy them. That combination is unusually powerful. It undermines the myth that success is simply a function of initial prowess. Instead, it suggests that durability in conflict arises from an organization's capacity to be self-critical, to empower corrective action, to supply the cure, to learn from observation, and to make the corrective actions habitual through practice. At dusk, when the valley's last smoke had been cleared and listening posts reported a thinning of enemy movement, the men who had been trained in those weeks did what they were expected to do. They consolidated positions, they tended to the wounded, they logged ammunition expenditures, and they wrote preliminary reports of what had worked. Those reports would be read by staff officers in other theaters and by training schools back home. In that quiet work, the lesson was extended beyond the valley's borders. Lessons must be documented if they are to be institutionalized. 70 years later, military professionals still teach the Tunisian episode as an instance of effective combined arms defense and rapid institutional learning. It is taught not as a fairy tale of instantaneous perfection, but as an instructive case of how multiple levers, leadership, doctrine, logistics, learning, rehearsal, can be pulled in sequence and in concert to produce a measurable advance in combat capability. Modern militaries borrow the language of after-action reviews. They use standardized liaison officers, and they train command and control relationships that echo the priorities refined in Tunisia. In that sense, the valley's smoke made permanent marks on military practice. We returned finally to the image of Terry Allen and his binoculars as the last transport rumbled past. The valley would heal in ways that are beyond the scope of any single narrative. Repairs made, letters written home, families notified, new officers promoted, and stale habits replaced by rehearsed routines. The strategic arc of 1943 would bend with many hands, but in a technical and human sense, the speed of American adaptation in Tunisia had proven that armies are not just instruments of politics. They are learning organizations capable of self-correction when their leaders permit and their institutions support it. If you found this look at the mechanics of rapid military adaptation useful, leave a comment. Where are you watching from? Or do you have a family member who served? Share this episode with someone who studies leadership under pressure. And if you want more deep dives into how decisions in the staff room become outcomes on the battlefield, subscribe and join the conversation.